talk. And tonight we have Saul David, who's one of our historians at the University of Buckingham. I'm very proud of that fact. Can I just say a word, which is that we love these talks. They're going to be upward of 1,000, probably well over, listening, and they're interactive. So do ask questions, brief if possible, and do state your name. And we're going to try and get them in. We're going to try for 20-25 minutes questions after the illustrated talk is over. But one of the great joys, and by the way, do circulate details of the talks. They're constantly being updated. Richard Curtis, of 4 Weddings, etc., funerals, is one of the latest people to say they're going to be speaking in it. Do circulate that list far and wide, so that more and more people can find out about it. One of the differences between us coming to you, if this was a literary festival, a history festival, or a lecture, is we'd be coming to you, would be in a neutral space, but here we're coming to you in your office. So it's just always a nice way to start if you say a few words about this room and the books behind you. Is this where you do your writing and work?
Exactly. Sorry, Anthony. Yes, absolutely right. I mean, I'm I'm all set to go in a place that I mean, a lot of the books behind me written by friends and colleagues. But yes, I'm in my study and I'm ready to go. So thank you for inviting me.
The wonderful book Crucible of Hell: The Heroism and Tragedy of Okinawa, published in early April, is Saul's book about this story, 75th anniversary, coming up next month, the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We're looking forward to it very much, and thank you for giving us this talk from your own writer's library and lair. It's a wonderful privilege to have that dimension.
Thank you, Anthony. Well, quite a bit of ground to cover, so I'll kick straight off. If we could move to from that first slide to the second slide, please. We've got a map of the Pacific here. The Japan is top left. You need to know where Japan is, of course, because in relation to Japan, Okinawa is a little bit below it. It's actually 400 miles south by sea distance, and you can see just about sea. There it is. We're just ringing the island of Okinawa. Now, just over 75 years ago, as Anthony was pointing out, on the 1st of April, which also happened to be an Easter Sunday, American troops invaded the 70-mile-long island of Okinawa. It was the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War, the last great clash of the Second World War, and a battle that would have profound consequences for the modern world, as we will discover. Now, why did they choose Okinawa? Well, it was the culmination of a two-pronged advance, both from the south that began on the 7th of August 1942. You can just about see the island of Guadalcanal, which is off Australia and to the east of New Guinea. A two-pronged advance that had begun there on the 7th of August 1942 had moved up through New Guinea and the Philippine Islands. That's one prong of advance, moving in that direction towards Japan. And then the other prong moving from Pearl Harbor, which is in the center of the Pacific Ocean, and all the way through the center of the Pacific. And those two prongs effectively met at Okinawa. So why did they choose Okinawa? Well, two reasons, I suppose. One, it was going to be used as a jumping off point for strategic air attacks to soften up Japan. And secondly, of course, they were going to launch an actual amphibious operation of Japan. And that was going to be the big battle scheduled for later in the year. And we'll come on to that because it's relevant to the decision to use atomic weapons. Now, if we can move on one more slide, we'll have a little look at the actual landing on Love Day, as it was known, the 1st of April 1945. Now, one of the first assault craft to hit the beach at H hour, 8:30 a.m., was a 22-year-old corporal called Jim Johnston from Nebraska. Now, as they approached the shore, Johnston thought of the dead Marines he had seen in the water and on the beach at Peleliu the previous September, and I quote, wondered what we would look like to the waves that would come behind us. He approached the pillbox, anticipating the impact of bullets ripping into my body, but there was no fire. The pillbox was empty. So he and his men moved inland, and within an hour, the beachhead was several hundred yards deep and growing by the minute. So I'm guessing you all realized the landing was unopposed. By nightfall, more than 60,000 men were on shore, occupying a beachhead 15,000 yards long and in places 5,000 yards deep. By the 2nd of April, US troops had reached the east coast, cutting the island in two. Now, if you just move on one more map, we'll be able to see, you can see the landings there in the center, and you can also see how quickly the attack develops, because this was the plan, and the plan was that you're not even going to take over that central part of the island until L15, that is 15 days beyond the initial landings. Actually, most of that area you can see in the center of the map was taken within just a couple of days, so they made extraordinary headway. The American commander and son of a famous Confederate leader, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., he was elated, as you can imagine he would be. We landed practically without opposition, he noted in his diary, and gained more ground than we expected to. The Japs have missed their best opportunity. You'll have to excuse the word Japs in contemporary correspondence, but that unfortunately is how they referred to them in those days. In fact, despite Buckner's optimism, the Americans had walked into a trap. Aware that their 80,000 soldiers, bolstered by around 20,000 Okinawan militia, were outgunned and outnumbered by the 180,000 American ground troops that were put on the island in the first week or so, the Japanese commanders had chosen to concentrate the bulk of their forces in the southern third of the island, where they had dug and blasted into coral rock, turning several jagged lines of ridges and rocky escarpment into formidable nests of interlocking pillboxes and firing positions. All were connected to a network of caves and passageways inside the hills that allowed the defenders to move safely to each point of attack. It was an extraordinarily sophisticated system of defense. More than 60 miles of underground tunnels had been dug, not just by the Japanese servicemen, but by the Okinawan civilians who were conscripted to do that. And they had created a system that was going to be incredibly difficult for the Americans to march through. If you move on one more map, we'll be able to see this is really where most of the fighting took place. The initial line that the Americans reached, the first really formidable period of defense or system of defense, is towards the top of the map. And at the bottom of the map, you can see the capital of Naha, and also just across from that, Shuri, which was the old royal capital. And it's at that point, you've got a series of defensive lines, and it's at that point between Naha and running through Shuri all the way to the east coast that the so-called Shuri line, which was the most formidable part of the defensive system, was located. Now, as the US Army's 24 Corps moved south towards the main Japanese defenses, the opposition inevitably stiffened. The first line, the line I just referred to, was the Kakuzu Hill Mass, which boasted an ideal combination of defensive features, including a deep moat, a hill studded with natural and man-made positions, and a cluster of thick-walled buildings. And as a result, a four-day assault, which began on the 9th of April, failed to break through the storm of Japanese artillery, mortar and machine gun fire, and cost the 24 Corps almost 3,000 casualties. One veteran described the operation as a meat grinder, and there would be more of that to come. There's then a pause while Buckner assembled more heavy artillery to blast the Japanese defenses. Buckner was very unimaginative in his tactics during most of this campaign, and he tended to believe, like a lot of officers who'd been schooled in US military academies in the 1930s, that artillery was the key to breaking through defensive positions, as of course it had been in the First World War. One of his chiefs of staff a man called Brigadier General Oliver Smith, disagreed. The artillery can blast away the camouflage and keep the enemy underground, he noted, but it cannot take the positions. And that delay only serves to increase total casualties and exhaust the troops. The delay of 10 days, that is the delay while they got more artillery forward, would give the Japanese the opportunity to get set, whereas continued pressure might have kept them off balance. And much as Buckner had feared, that's exactly what happened. So when a second offensive in late April takes place, it makes very little headway. It's at this point that Buckner is urged by his subordinates to try an amphibious landing behind these main positions towards the south of the island, and that was eminently possible. He refused, or at least his staff officers refused, on the grounds that the beaches in the south were too small for resupply, and there was a danger the troops who landed would fail to break out of their beachhead, much as they had at Anzio in 1944, early 1944. But in my view, it was a missed opportunity, certainly one that should have been looked into more seriously and probably attempted. Why? Well, of course, we know with the benefit of the hindsight what happened next, but they already had a pretty clear idea on Okinawa towards the end of April 1945. It was a missed opportunity in my view. And Buckner, interestingly, admitted as much to his wife that that his decision would have costly consequences when he wrote, "The defenders here seem to have the strongest position yet encountered in the Pacific, and it will be a slow, tedious grind with flamethrowers, explosives placed by hand, and the closest of teamwork to dislodge them without very heavy losses." Now, in early May, thanks to these initial setbacks, Buckner brings his second major corps. So he's got two large formations of troops. One's an army corps, the one I've already referred to, the 24th, but he also had some very experienced Marines on the island, the 3rd Amphibious Corps. And it's now that he decides to bring them into the battle so that they will be fighting alongside the army troops. The first view of the battle zone was a shock to a first lieutenant from the Marines, a man called Watkins from Manchester, Connecticut, and also a veteran of the fighting on Peleliu. As we moved up to relieve the 27th Division, recall Watkins, they passed us in bedraggled lines. They had what we call the 1,000-yard stare. Their casualties were everywhere. And as our rifle platoons took over their foxholes, they hastened wordlessly to the rear. There was heavy incoming fire. Mortars and artillery shells were landing all around us, and we started to take casualties. The mournful cry of corpsmen was heard once again. Another Marine likened the shattered terrain to black and white photos of the Western Front during the First World War. Muted earth tones, scant vegetation, pitted and pocked ridges from the constant shelling, and in the many shell holes along the muted ground lay the detritus of war in its myriad forms. Empty cases of ammunition, spent shell cases, burnt out military vehicles of all types, discarded personal equipment. And on the journey in, he noted, they had passed rows of army dead covered in ponchos, most of them bootless, their buddies, as he noted, having scavenged the best part for their own use. Now, it's during this phase of the fighting, and if we move on one more, so that give you an idea of the sort of conditions in which they're fighting. That's actually a little bit closer to the Shuri line, but it was pretty much like that all the way through the central part of the battlefield. If you move on one more slide, we get a very famous picture. Just one more slide. Thank you. This is the very famous picture of Desmond Doss. Any of you have seen the film Hacksaw Ridge will know all about this story, and it's very close to the actual truth. So who was Doss? Well, Private First Class Desmond Doss was a 26-year-old Seventh-day Adventist from Lynchburg, Virginia, who joined up as a medic to avoid the need to kill, won the Medal of Honor by rescuing up to 75 wounded men who had been abandoned by their comrades, and won the Medal of Honor by rescuing up to 75 wounded men who'd been abandoned by their comrades on top of the ridge. Now, you can see the picture of Doss. That's the actual ridge itself. And what happened is that during the battle, a counterattack forced most of Doss's comrades off the ridge and left the wounded behind. Doss made the decision to stay there incredibly bravely, almost suicidally in my view, and one by one he lowered the wounded. First of all, he had to collect them, then he had to get them into a kind of sling made of two bowline knots that he'd rigged together, and he lowered them one by one off the mountain. And meanwhile, no one went up the mountain, which is a point not often mentioned, to actually assist him. All the time he's thinking, I'm not going to make it, I'm not going to make it. There's a very graphic quote here. How I was going to get all those men down, I didn't know, he recalled. I just kept praying, Lord, please help me get one more. He was determined not to leave a single man alive on the top of the ridge. And so for 5 hours, during which period at any point the Japanese could have had a look, realized there was no one there, and come and killed everyone, he got man after man after man down the slope until he'd got probably 75. Certainly that's the number that was given for the Medal of Honor that he won for this. Also, he wrote when he got down, after I got the last man off, I came down. My clothes were bloody. I'd been soaked to the skin by the blood of the men. It's an extraordinary act of courage, one of the most extraordinary I've seen in all my years of studying warfare, and he was a very deserved winner of the Medal of Honor. One more slide forward, we'll see another famous feature on Okinawa, and this is Sugar Loaf Hill. Now, believe it or not, having looked at that picture, it seems like it's rising quite steeply out of the ground, but it's actually only 100 yards long and 100 feet high. Sugar Loaf Hill. It took more than a week for the 6th Marine Division to capture that feature, and in that time they lost 2,600 casualties, including 3 battalion commanders and 9 company commanders, and a further 1,200 cases of combat fatigue. With rain adding to the misery, the battlefield quickly became a hellish sight. For several feet around every corpse wrote Eugene's sledge of the 3 5th Marines. Maggots crawled about in the muck and then were washed off by the run of the rain. There wasn't a tree or bush left. All that was left was open country. Shells had torn up the turf so completely that the ground cover was non-existent. The scene was nothing but mud, shell fire, flooded craters with their silent, pathetic, rotting occupants, knocked out tanks and Amtraks and discarded equipment. Utter desolation. Now, I think, as is well known, determined to defend Okinawa to the last, the Japanese fought with suicidal bravery, and they used every trick in the book to try and defend the island. The garrison was supported by waves of kamikaze attacks from planes, manned rockets, human torpedoes, and even ships launched on suicide missions from the home islands. The planes were flown by officers of the Shimpu Tokatai, as it was known, the Divine Wind Special Attack Units, who had pledged to crash their airplanes into enemy ships in acts of self-immolation. Before one mission, a group of kamikaze told bawdy jokes boasting of sexual experiences they didn't actually have. Bathos quickly shifted to pathos when they boarded their planes and mumbled farewell to their mothers. If you just move on one more slide, we'll see one of these men. Here's Ensign Kiyoshi Ogawa. His plane hit the USS Bunker Hill on the 11th of May. And if we move on one more, you can see an actual picture of the Bunker Hill after it's been struck by that plane. Now, another pilot involved, we think, in the same mission, asked permission before he went on this attack to marry his stepsister. She agreed, and they spent a last night together. At the time, she wrote later, I thought it was natural he would die. It would have been shameful for him to go on living, which just gives a little bit of an insight into, the moral imperative a lot of these kamikaze felt to protect their homeland by giving their lives. Only after his death, possibly crashing in his plane into the aircraft carrier USS Bunker Hill, as we can see here, on the 11th of May, did she discover, that is his stepsister, who's become his wife, that she was pregnant. Left to fight on alone, the Japanese garrison made a desperate last stand on the southern tip of the island, where it had herded many civilians. The end finally came on the 22nd of June 1945, when the 10th Army headquarters announced that all organized resistance on Okinawa had ceased, though it would take another week to complete the mopping up operation. And just before we get to the end game, I want to give you a few statistics. If we can move on one slide. Total number of kamikaze attacks, 2,000 sorties were made by kamikaze. They sank 36 ships and damaged a further 368, which meant they were the heaviest US naval losses of the war. And if you move on one more, we get to the point at which I've reached in my talk. This is the bottom of the island. So having been forced out of the Shuri line, they retreat to the southern part of the island, and the end game finally comes in June 21st, 22nd, as I've explained, where they finally announced that organized resistance has ended. And if you go on one more picture, this is a very famous picture, but not quite as famous as the picture of raising the Stars and Stripes on Iwo Jima, but this is them raising the Stars and Stripes at the bottom of Okinawa. So let's have a few more statistics. If you can move on one more slide. So the battle had lasted for 83 blood-soaked days, and I've just given you just a tiny flavor of some of the conditions in which people were expected to fight. Casualties were appalling. Up to 110,000 Japanese and Okinawan defenders, as you can see here. And by Okinawan defenders, of course, I mean people who are in the militia. 12,500 American servicemen out of total casualties of 70,000, making it by far the bloodiest US battle of the Pacific and one of the costliest in its history. And here's the really sad bit, 125,000 Okinawan civilians. It's almost hard to believe. A third of the pre-war population who are either caught in the crossfire or believed, and this was the majority of them unfortunately, believed Japanese propaganda that it was better to commit mass suicide than be raped and murdered by the Americans. And if you move on one more slide, we'll get a picture of just one of these victims, Mio Takasu, one of 118 student nurses aged between 15 to 19 who were conscripted into corps to help doctors, to help the medical services, and who perished in the battle. So now among the fatalities, just go through a few of the famous names. Here's Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, who I mentioned before. He dies on the 18th of June, hit by a Japanese shell, the most senior American serviceman to die, or joint most senior American serviceman to die in the Second World War. Move on one more slide. The Japanese commander also dies. He commits ritual suicide a few days after Buckner. And also, interestingly enough, one of the most famous American war correspondents, Ernie Pyle, who's shot by a sniper on an island just off Okinawa on April the 18th, as you can see here. But it's even more than the appalling ferocity of the fighting. It's the far-reaching consequences of the battle, in my view, that make it one of the most significant in world history. So what happens next? Well, if we can move on one slide, we'll go back to the original picture of the Pacific, which will give you a sense of what's going to happen next, because there's a crucial meeting held on the 18th of June by President Harry S. Truman and his military chiefs to discuss Japan's unconditional surrender. The only way to achieve this, said the US Army Chief of Staff, George C. Marshall, was to invade Japan's home islands with a force of 750,000 men, an operation scheduled for the 1st of November. Now, that would be followed up by an even bigger invasion the following spring. And of course, inevitably, there's a sense at that meeting that the casualties are going to be very bad. How bad, asked Truman. No one can say for sure, but they suspect up to 1 million casualties. And it's at this point that Truman understandably says, is there an option? And of course, there is an option, because they have been developing for many years a fact that Truman, who's only become president on the 10th of April after the death of Roosevelt, knows himself now, he's been led into the secret that they have been developing atomic weapons. So the question is, will they work? And when Truman asked, is there anything else we can consider? One of the Undersecretary of State for War says, we do have the atomic weapons. So it's at this crucial meeting on the 18th of June that it's decided if the atomic weapons work, they will consider using them. So we then move forward to the so-called Potsdam Conference, which takes place in the middle of July, at which it's an inter-allied conference in Berlin, attended by all the major leaders of the Allies, and that, of course, is Truman, Stalin, and Churchill. And it's at that conference that Truman finally gets information that they've tested the bomb and the bomb works. So he immediately tells Churchill. They also let Stalin into the secret. And there's a decision, at least among the Western allies, that is Churchill and Truman, that they are going to issue a final ultimatum to the Japanese. And if they refuse to, if they don't pay any attention to it, they will indeed drop a nuclear weapon. And that, of course, is exactly what happens. The ultimatum, the so-called Potsdam Declaration, is issued. It is ignored, and the decision is taken to drop the first nuclear weapon, and that, of course, is Hiroshima on the 6th of August 1945. And you can see at the bottom of the main island of Japan, there is Hiroshima with the 6th of August 1945 next to it. And then 3 days later, a second bomb on Nagasaki. I mean, feel free to ask me why there was a second bomb. I won't go into that now, but I'm just going to give you some of the responses to the dropping of those bombs, particularly from American servicemen. But before we go there, we do need to mention the probable number of dead from those two atomic weapons, which was at least 200,000. You know, horrific casualties, there's no doubt about it. But of course, in this very tough calculation that Truman was making, certainly fewer than he expected to die on the main island of Japan if they had been forced to invade. Japan sues for peace, or begins suing for peace on August the 10th, and finally agrees to an unconditional surrender as long as the emperor can stay on the throne on the 14th, and the Second World War is finally over. Much to the delight and relief, as I've already referred to, of most Americans, and particularly those who would have taken part in the invasion of Japan. Our hopes had been dashed so often, recalled Lieutenant Bruce Watkins, that it took several days to absorb the impact of this event. Relief flooded so slowly into our veins, and we began to dare to think of going home. Now, Winston Churchill was convinced the bomb had served its purpose. He wrote later that the final decision lay in the main with President Truman, who had the weapon. But I never doubted what it would be, nor have I ever doubted since that he was right. The historic fact remains, and must be judged in the aftertime, that the decision whether or not to use the atomic bomb to compel the surrender of Japan was never an issue. There was unanimous, automatic, unquestioned agreement around our table, nor did I ever hear the slightest suggestion that we should do otherwise. A key and often overlooked factor in Truman's decision, acknowledged by Churchill, was the effect the fanatical Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima, and in particular Okinawa, not to mention the crippling civilian casualties, had had on him and his advisors. And one of the things I forgot to mention during that crucial meeting on 18th of June was that they'd actually talked about the casualties on Okinawa, and Truman had, expressed his absolute horror. His predicament was ably summed up by a duty officer in the White House map room, which was really the communications center during the Second World War. And this officer wrote later, "We were losing tragically large numbers of soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen in the Pacific. We had been through those bitter struggles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. We knew the ferocity with which the Japanese would defend every square yard of territory that they held. We had seen the effects of the kamikaze raids. We were proceeding with plans for the invasion of Japan in the fall. And the casualty estimates which the Army and Navy were making were heart-sickening. Not only would Americans have lost their lives in great numbers, so would the Japanese. The numbers of lives lost by the dropping of those two bombs was a fraction of the number that would have been lost had the war proceeded." And just a final quick point, a quote by Truman himself a few years later in 1963, he wrote, "I knew what I was doing when I stopped the war that would have killed 500,000 youngsters on both sides if those bombs had not been dropped." So I'll end there, and I would welcome questions on any of the points I've made. It's a bit of a rapid tour de raison of the Battle of Okinawa and the events that happened afterwards. Needless to say, there's a lot more detail to be found in my book, and you can certainly get a bit more from me now during questions. So thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much indeed there, Saul. Absolutely wonderful, compelling talk. We have well over 1,000 people again listening to this, and we're going to see your face back there on the screen. Nice to see you back. Can you tell us, I'll come through to the questions in a moment, and just again encouragement to everyone to ask the questions that you'd always wanted to ask. Can you tell us why you wrote this book?
It's serendipity, actually. I mean, I was working on my previous book to this one, which was the story of a very small and not that well-known American Special Forces unit. And during the sequence of training, and just before they go into operations in Europe, this unit is sent to the Pacific. They don't actually do any fighting because they're sent to the Aleutians, and by the time they arrived on the island in the Aleutians, the Japanese had already withdrawn. But it got me thinking about the Pacific War. And I think from the perspective of certainly most British historians, we tend to concentrate very much on the front over here, the European front, and the front in North Africa, and possibly Burma to a certain extent. But we know very little about the Pacific Island War. And so it was a tremendous challenge, really. It was a challenge to go and work in the American archives, and it was a great privilege to go out over to Japan and also to Okinawa itself to see the battlefield and to dig up some sources there. And I hope, certainly it was my intention to have told this story from both sides, to very much give the Okinawan and Japanese perspective as well.
And how does it help? We had last week Max Hastings talking about the Second World War, Simon Heffer on the First World War. Not too many female military historians. Would love to have you on if you want to, listening to this. But Saul, how does it help a historian to go to the battlefield itself?
I think if you're covering an enormous period of history, I mean, for example, one of my previous books was All the King's Men, which was looking at British warfare for 150 years, and really you've got no chance of. And I talked about a lot of battles, and there's no chance of covering all the ground there. But if you're concentrating on a single campaign with a single location like this one, I think you would be mad not to go if time and finance enable you to do so. The advantages, of course, I think are reasonably obvious in the sense that you get to see the terrain. Sometimes it's changed, of course, Anthony. I mean, I know you're a great battlefield walker and tourist yourself, and guide. And battlefields in Europe, like Waterloo, for example, some of it's the same and some of it's very different. You know, the famous ridgeline where Wellington stood has been dug up and turned into the Lion Mound. But in Okinawa, although a lot of the battlefield itself has been built up, you can still see the ridgelines. You can still get a sense of the coral. I didn't really talk about the terrain. I didn't really have much time to talk about the terrain, but it's coral rock. It was incredibly inhospitable terrain to fight over, and you really need to see it and feel it and touch it and get a sense of the climate, I think, to get under the skin of what fighting in a campaign like that must have been like. And just to finish, a final point about the coral rock. If you think about it, it has two problems for attacking troops. You can't dig into it because it's very difficult to dig a foxhole through rock. And if a projectile hits it, a bullet or shell or a mortar round, it creates extra shrapnel. So it was incredibly dangerous for the Americans to operate in this terrain. And they did it, you know, doggedly and determinedly, and really my heart goes out for any of the servicemen of both sides who had to fight on Okinawa.
So you referred to Hacksaw Ridge, the film that many would have seen. Many would have seen the Band of Brothers. And just any more thoughts there about the Pacific series, the follow-up to Band of Brothers? It was partly filmed in Okinawa, featured in it.
Yes, that's right.
And would you say, having written this book, what was it?
I think there was a great missed opportunity actually with the Pacific series, because one of the reasons why Band of Brothers, which it was really supposed to be the Band of Brothers of the Pacific, one of the reasons Band of Brothers worked so well is because, you know, when you're making films as opposed to writing books, you really need to concentrate on the cast can't be too big. So in Band of Brothers, you can follow a small group who move from one engagement to the next, and some of them get killed and some of them behave badly. But you very much get a relationship with those people. What happened with the Pacific is because that book didn't exist, they patched together 4 or 5 or 6 different stories from servicemen who didn't actually all fight in the same unit. And so you had someone who fought on Iwo Jima, someone who fought on Guadalcanal, someone who fought on Peleliu, and someone who fought, as you say, Anthony, on Okinawa. Now, interestingly enough, I am trying to, you might say the horse has already bolted, but I am trying to fill the gap in the story, because I think there's a real opportunity to tell the whole story of the Pacific from the perspective of a small group of people. So that's what I'm doing. I've chosen a unit of Marines who go all the way through from Guadalcanal all the way to Okinawa. And the reason I've chosen this specific unit is because there are an awful lot of very literary people, some immensely talented people. One of the interesting things about the Marines is that a lot of the ordinary soldiers who went into the Marines were college educated, or at least would have been if they'd stayed on, as they could have done so. And they chose to go into the Marines because they wanted to get into the fight. And the benefit from a historian is that there's a lot of very, very good writing. So that's the plan to do next. And Okinawa is really, each of the campaigns ramps up on the last one. So Guadalcanal was bad, and then New Britain, the so-called Green Hell as it was called, then Peleliu, which was sort of Iwo Jima but for the 1st Marine Division, and then finally Okinawa. And you get a sense of the unfolding of this really horrific and pitiless war.
And why, just finally before the questions, did the Americans not learn from this experience of fighting jungle war, and did they then commit to the Vietnam War? Was anybody saying this is not a good idea?
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? And the Marines are involved, as of course they were in Korea too. I think they, you know, there's a tremendous danger, always has been for the Americans actually, to rely on firepower. I talked a little bit about how Buckner, during the fighting on Okinawa, was determined to use his firepower. And by the way, it wasn't just artillery. I talked about the artillery, but he was, of course, using ships firing from offshore. He was using planes, and they were hoping to blast the Japanese out of the ground. But you're absolutely right. It was incredibly difficult to do. They lost a lot of men doing it. And exactly the same problem would resurface when they got to Vietnam, because they assumed they could use their superior firepower to blast the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. But a much more complicated, I suppose it was a much more complicated lesson really to learn in Vietnam, in the sense that the civilians were actively against them, or at least a chunk of civilians were. Okinawa, you certainly the civilian population had been conscripted by the Japanese, but they were not terribly sympathetic, I think, by this stage of the war to the Japanese cause, even though, as I should have mentioned, Okinawa was by this stage a part of Japan proper, in the sense that it was the most southerly prefecture, so it's part of the political system.
So, and if you're enjoying this, I'm sure everybody is. The numbers are going up and up all the time. Always a good sign, because people can leave these virtual talks, whereas they never leave a talk in an auditorium or theatre. But if you are, then you can have a lot more of Saul David by joining our London programs, and if you're new to the University of Buckingham, we offer these wonderful 2-year undergraduate degrees and a host of fabulous postgrad degrees. Now we're going to come through. The first question is in fact from one of our medical students who says he wants to go and apply to the RAF. And thanks, Bucky, for this question. And it's just, can you say anything more, Saul, about the British role in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? I did chair Leonard Cheshire, who gave a talk in the 80s, who was an observer, I think, for Nagasaki rather than Hiroshima. You will know.
Yes, I'm funny enough, I'm not absolutely sure that he was on one of the planes. That may well be the case. I gave the quote, the Churchill quote. I mean, I think it's important to stress, as Churchill himself acknowledged, that the decision was going to be taken by the Americans. Of course, they wanted the British on board, and we were co-signatories of the Declaration of Potsdam. But frankly, the Americans were going to do this anyway. They had the technology. Yes, of course, we were involved in the development of the technology, but by 1944, 1945, all the work's really going on. It's concentrated in America, and it's very much an American decision. But I should stress again that Churchill, he wasn't going through the motions. He absolutely believed, as did every senior advisor to Truman at that time, his own advisors, of course, and the British advisors, that it did make sense to drop these bombs. They didn't want to do it, but if they could avoid everybody knew the catastrophic loss of life that there would have been on both sides when they eventually got to the island. Now, of course, I'm moving on a little bit to probably other questions, so I'll shut down that line of argument now. But just to say one more thing about British involvement, because some people like to ask, well, weren't the British involved in the actual fighting in Okinawa? Not specifically on the island, but they were involved at the so-called British Pacific Fleet, which was the largest naval force we'd got together during the whole of the Second World War, was involved in the Okinawan operations. Not the island itself, but a smaller group of islands to the south, the Sakamoto Gunto Islands, that housed a lot of airfields, Japanese airfields, and the British job, the British Pacific Fleet's job, was to strike those airfields with fighters and bombers from the aircraft carriers and knock them out. And they did a very good job, actually, and they themselves were attacked by a lot of kamikaze bombers, and a number of ships were hit. So we did not come through the Battle of Okinawa unscathed, the British, that is.
Max Hastings was saying in this series of talks last week that he thought of the three services, it was the British Navy that was the most successful, comfortably over the Army and the Air Force. I don't know if you have a view about that.
Yes, I do. I do, Anthony, and I should also flag up, I think, one of the great success stories of my program over recent years. A hugely talented historian, one of the most talented historians on the block, as it were, a man called Dr. Andy Boyd, who, although in his 60s, with at least two very successful careers behind him, has written two books on the Navy, the second of which is about to come out. And the first one is really about the contribution the Navy made to the Pacific and Ocean War, Indian Ocean War. Wonderful, wonderful book. And then the follow-up to that, which is about naval intelligence all the way through the 20th century. And he makes the point, as you've just made, and as Max has also made, that really the Navy, which had historiographically not come that well out of the Second World War, actually, when you look at the finer detail, does some pretty impressive things. And it does some pretty impressive things, according to Andy Boyd's latest book, an early copy of which I've just seen, it's not out yet, all the way through the 20th century. So that'll be very interesting reading. It's a book about naval intelligence in the 20th century. But yes, I agree with Max.
I hope this talk will encourage many to study more, certainly, and perhaps even to join one of your programs, Saul. Thank you very much. And you go right up in age. Was it one of your students who was in their early 90s?
That's right. We had a veteran of D-Day, and Arnhem, and there was a wonderful moment during one of our talks, Anthony, where he was there listening, but as a student, of course, and someone was talking about the Second World War and about weapons during the Second World War, and he put his hand up and said, no, you're wrong about the weapons you say, were there. And the speaker said, no, I'm absolutely not wrong. I've looked at all the documents, and I can tell you, the primary sources tell us that they had these weapons. He said, I'm telling you, you're wrong. And the reason I know it is I was actually there myself.
That's so unfair when students do that to historians. On to Bill Robbins, who says, putting aside the endgame of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was Okinawa a strategically necessary battle to fight? Could it have been bypassed, in fact, even if there hadn't been an A-bomb option?
No, I don't think so, actually. It was necessary. There were previous campaigns that you could certainly call into question, and I think probably the easiest one to draw into that category is Peleliu, which was taken with tremendous loss and also involving the Marines the previous September. And I mentioned a couple of quotes of people who'd fought on Peleliu, and it was a really horrific experience, as bad as Okinawa. But no, the reason Okinawa needed to be taken is because of its size, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, and its proximity to Japan proper. If you're going to put pressure on the Japanese to come to terms, they must know that you're in a position from which you can strike their mainland. Actually, it's my view that even that wouldn't have been enough to cause them to surrender, hence the decision to use nuclear weapons. But certainly the next stage of the strategy was to go to Okinawa. There were other options. They were talking about going to Taiwan or Formosa, as it was known at the time, and also to China. And both of those, frankly, would have delayed the end of the war and would have involved some pretty brutal fighting too, because I don't know if many of the watchers realize there were an awful lot of Japanese troops still in control of big chunks of China, including Taiwan. So I think it was a sensible decision. It was strongly held. It was a brutal battle, but it was necessary to get that little bit closer to Japan.
And thank you very much indeed, Saul. Hongbo says, did the Americans learn anything from the experience they'd had at Iwo Jima before they invaded Okinawa? And is there anything in the theory that says dropping the H-bomb was in part to warn Stalin of the Soviet Union?
Well, I take the first part of that question. Iwo Jima took place in March, which was just before Okinawa. Did they learn much? No, frankly. I mean, and interestingly enough, Iwo Jima followed very similar lines, incredibly well dug in defenders who had to be rooted out just slowly but surely. There is another interesting point about Okinawa that's not directly specific to that question, but I'll just refer to anyway, and that is the question of whether or not they needed to keep fighting for the whole of the island, whether they could have left the Japanese penned in at one particular point, particularly towards the end of the battle, where they had them right down at the bottom of the island, and all the airfields, which is what they really wanted, were in American hands. That's an interesting argument. I suspect that they wouldn't have. Clearly they didn't want to do it, but it was a possibility. Did they learn from Iwo Jima? No. First point. And remind me the second part of that question, Matt.
That was it. It was about what did they learn. If the answer was no, they didn't. We've covered it.
Okay.
You've done that. Howard Mordew says, since there was a clear line of communication to the Japanese when the Americans gave the ultimatum, why wouldn't an atomic bomb dropped near Japan have persuaded them to surrender, perhaps in the sea?
Well, it's a good question, and people have argued.
And did anyone say that at the time?
Well,
were they fully aware of the unbelievable cruelty and the death and the radiation?
Yes, they were, and they felt. And by the way, when I say they, don't just think I'm referring to the politicians and the military men. I'm also referring to the scientists. There is a bit of a misunderstanding, a feeling that scientists were very much against the dropping of the bomb. In actual fact, the so-called scientific committee that was the advisory committee of all the main people involved in the development of the atomic bomb were saying you needed to drop it on an actual city. It was their advice. It was the scientists' advice to drop it on the city. Now, why would they argue that? The reason is reasonably simple, Anthony. They did not believe that the Japanese were going to be convinced by anything other than the actual sight of in their own eyes of seeing their people suffer and their cities flattened. It was the only way they felt. And I'm talking about the scientists again, and an argument that was accepted by the politicians, that they needed to actually witness it. And I think they might have been right, actually. You know, it's very tempting for us to think, wasn't there an alternative? But the reason why you need to get your head. We need to get our heads around how utterly determined the Japanese were to fight on. That is the hardliners, and it really did take something quite significant to change their minds.
One thing we've learned about COVID is that the scientists can say things, Saul, but it is ultimately a political decision.
Yeah.
But let's keep that one hanging there, because there's so many questions coming up. Eric is saying about the imminent threat of a Russian invasion and the influence of that. And today, the Battle of Okinawa is revered in America for its various acts of heroism. The film Hacksaw Ridge. Does Japanese society also venerate, good question, the Japanese defenders despite their fanaticism? And indeed, was it fanaticism? Is that just our gloss?
Well, you know, it certainly appeared to the Americans as if the defense was fanatical. What I would say is a point I made earlier in this talk, Anthony. What I've tried to do is get inside, not easy to do, but get inside the minds of the Japanese of the 1940s, who they were, what sort of military culture they came from, and why they did what they did. And I'll just make one very quick point about so-called suicide bombers, which of course what the kamikaze have been compared to. In Japanese culture and Japanese religion and Japanese military ethos, suicide is not like it is for us as from a Judeo-Christian society, is not something to be avoided. It's something to be celebrated. Self-sacrifice in the interest of your nation. So the determination to fight on was entirely for that purpose. It seemed to the Westerners, it seemed to us as fanatical. To the Japanese, it was incredibly heroic. So to follow that on, do they recognize this heroism today? No, sadly, not particularly, because they do not like going over the ground of the Second World War. But on the other hand, the Yusukuni shrine, which has been quite controversial in recent times in Tokyo, which is where people who have committed suicide in the interest of the state, the kamikaze, go, which is where their war heroes go in their kind of semi-godlike status, does still have a sizable following. And one last thing to add to that, Anthony, I've just heard, very pleased to hear it too, that a Japanese publisher is publishing my book on Okinawa. So it may be that after all these years that there is a sense that the Japanese public is more amenable to reading about its past and celebrating the determination and heroism, as much as being slightly appalled at some of the, the more questionable activities of the Japanese.
So, question: is there a similar detachment in the Japanese people from the excesses of the camps and kamikaze? By the way, good to know how many kamikaze planes actually kamikaze pilots lost their lives. In a similar way, in Germany, there's a detachment from the Nazis from the ordinary German people. I mean, this question of reconciliation after the Second World War nationally is such an acute one. Can you say anything more about that?
Well, I mean, I think the sadness is that the Japanese, and maybe publishing my book and other similar types of book will be moving some way towards this. They haven't really come to terms with some of the darker aspects of the Second World War. Unlike, and this is where I contrast the point with Germany, whereas Germany absolutely has come to terms with the really dark aspects. You're right, there's an attempt to split the Nazis from the rest of the population. That division, by the way, has been much muddied by a recent historiography by both German and British historians. But in Japan, that hasn't really happened. There hasn't been enough written, and it hasn't been enough consumed in Japan, and there hasn't been enough history taught in schools for them to make a proper judgment about what was admirable and what was appalling about their actions in the Second World War. So we hope that will change. And just to refer back to one other thing which you mentioned earlier, which I didn't really deal with, but it is an important point, and you touched on it again a minute ago, and that is the Russian involvement in the end of the Second World War. Some people say, well, the bomb was dropped because they knew the Russians were coming in and they were going to be able to make ground and gain new territory. No, I don't think that is a factor. And you need to look at the actual timing as well. The Russians we'd been begging them since the beginning of the year. That is, the Western allies had been begging the Russians since the beginning of the year to get involved, and they wouldn't really commit. And they only finally committed, interestingly enough, in a timing sense, after the dropping of Hiroshima. So there was no guarantee the Russians were going to come in. And even if they were going to come in, how long was it actually going to take them for them to make any ground? They did make good ground in Manchuria, but the only reason they made good ground in Manchuria, or they made ground so quickly, is because the Japanese had effectively given up after the dropping of the 2 atomic weapons. So I think that's a bit of a red herring personally, but you can't entirely discount the fact that the Americans were quite keen to show the Russians, for future Cold War issues, that they had this incredibly powerful weapon.
Question now about the film Pearl Harbor that many will remember, and did it have Kate Blanchett? I can't remember. I'll be corrected by all of.
It was. I think it's Kate Beckinsale, actually.
Thank you very much indeed. And that film, how accurate, Jen asks, is it? And how close to the truth? And how important is it to the US to keep producing these great national narratives where they do extraordinarily well in these films? Well,
I think Pearl Harbor is an incredibly traumatic moment in American history, as it goes without saying, needless to say. And the way it's portrayed in a film, of course, is always going to be exaggerated, and they had the love story, but the basic beats of the story are indisputable, which is that the Japanese did launch an attack that was unanticipated, unexpected, before any declaration of war. It was delivered to wipe out the American Pacific Fleet, and it almost succeeded. It knocked out their battleships, but it didn't knock out, interestingly enough, their aircraft carriers, and that made a big difference to the Americans in the forthcoming war. What you see as the war unfolds after Pearl Harbor is this gradual determination to wipe out the slur, the stain, as it were, on their military character that Pearl Harbor had actually given. Excuse me a second, Anthony. I'm going to lose my power in a second, so I'm just going to make sure I've got power. But keep talking. I'll
Louise is saying, if you can hear me, great talk. At least until the threat of losing power. Do you have a website where we can see more information and recommendations for places to visit?
Yes, the Okinawa Island itself is a wonderful place to visit. The way to get there is reasonably straightforward too. You can actually fly straight into Okinawa, or you can fly to Japan, as I did, to Tokyo first of all, and then a quick island hop from there. I think it's about an hour and a half flight to the capital, Naha. It's a beautiful island. The middle bit of it's quite built up, but if you go to the north, you get a sense of the absolute beauty of the island. It's tropical, of course, so the conditions there are usually reasonably warm, although it can get a lot of rain and a lot of water in their wet season. So that's to be avoided, and that's one of the points I didn't make during the actual talk. Actually, some of the fighting was done in the most appalling conditions because of the rainstorms that lashed the islands during the actual fighting. And it was really tough conditions, but it's a beautiful island to visit, and I would urge anyone who wants to look into a little bit more into the story of the Pacific War to see some of those Pacific islands and not just Okinawa.
And your own website?
My own website, sauldavid.co.uk. It's got all information about the books. It's got information about my research, my teaching. And just to stress the point you made earlier, if anyone is interested in learning the business, the nuts and bolts of actually doing history, then please come and join my MA in Military History program. It starts in late September and runs either for a year for full-time or 2 years for part-time. And we have a wonderful mix of people from their 20s to their 90s, as you pointed out earlier. And if you think you might have, the historian's hat on, or you'd like to put it on at some point, then please come and join us.
Laura says, thank you for that. Laura says, as we approach the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki next month, the world faces the prospect of a dangerous new nuclear arms race. We had Ian Golden on the Festival of Higher Education, who founded the Oxford Martin School Looking at the Future, talking earlier, saying that we're now more likely to have nuclear war, but also even more likely still to have war created by pathogens. Do we ever learn from history, Laura says?
Well, I'd always be wary. I am always wary about talking about current events and future events in relation to the past. Now, that may seem a strange thing to admit, but our job really is to analyze, discuss, and make some sense of the past in a very imperfect way, and to try and draw conclusions with what's happening now, what might happen, I think is optimistic. So the simple answer to your question is, no, we don't learn from the past. But one of the reasons we don't learn from the past, Anthony, is because the conditions are never that comparable, actually. And a last thought about nuclear weapons, because I want to leave on a vaguely optimistic note. I know there are dire warnings of the threat that we face in the world, and it's the business of journalists and commentators to always look at the darkest episodes. But my personal view about nuclear weapons is not quite as doom-laden as most people. It was a brutally tough decision to use them in 1945, but they have not been used again, and we have not had a major war between major powers directly, force on force. Of course, there have been lots of proxy wars, and that is something, in my view. And is that because of nuclear weapons? Is it in spite of nuclear weapons? I think nuclear weapons have played their their part. They, you wouldn't go so far as to call them a force for good, but they have prevented another world war, or at least we haven't had another world war since they were invented.
Two very quick final questions. One about picking you up on surprise there about the Allies, specifically the Americans, knowing how horrific was going to be the effect of radiation poisoning. How could they have known about that? And the other was, did the Allies have any kind of moral equivalence between the concentration camps, 6 million killed, overseen by Germany and Allies, compared to the camps that the Japanese had, which, unless I'm wrong, were not extermination camps?
No, that's right. Well, the first point about radiation sickness is absolutely right. So when I said, were the Americans aware of the damage it would do, they were aware of the destruction it would create with the actual explosion. No, I don't think they were. I mean, of course, the scientists weren't unaware of the dangers of radiation sickness, but did they realize what an appalling experience it would be and how long it would last for? They don't seem to have been discussing that in any detail. And I've looked at all the documents of the Scientific Advisory Committee and in the months leading up to that. So that is a very good point. As for the moral equivalence of the German camps and the Japanese camps were appalling places to be, but they were not death camps. A lot of people died in them. In fact, the casualty figures you were much more likely, interestingly enough, and this is an interesting comparison to make, you're much more likely to die as an Allied serviceman in the hands of the Japanese than you were as an Allied serviceman in the hands of the Germans. I'm not, of course, including in that group the Russian prisoners of war of the Germans, who were treated appallingly badly and died in huge numbers. But certainly British servicemen were much more likely to die in the hands of the Japanese. But none of that, I think, really particularly played into the decision. What played into the decision by the Japanese in the end, the Americans in the end, was the determination not to lose vast numbers of soldiers. Yes, they were conscious that it would probably save the lives, as they would have argued, of Japanese as well, but they did not want to lose another 500,000 boys from all across America.
I think my final thought would be how inspiring the Japanese example has been since the war finished in the last 75 years, and what a beacon for many great developments Japan has been. Very different to Germany after the First World War, for example. Saul, you very wonderfully give, we're going to finish there, I mean, you give everybody such a vivid sense of the nature of history, what it was like to be there, but also its long footprint, its long sense echoes to our present day. This is a great highlight of the talks. Thank you very much for bringing it so fully to life. Do look up Saul's website. Do read his book, above all, obviously. And do pass on details of this lecture series. Maybe we could have you back again, Saul, later. Do pass on the details so others can enjoy and take part. Thank you for really great questions tonight. Thank you all of you very, very much. There's no talk tomorrow night. We've got then a feast of talks in the following week. Thank you all very much indeed, and good night for now.